let me be clear. These are not the specific measures when you can go back to work or school or when you can see your neighbors or extended family or friends. This framework will lay out the things that need to happen before we take any next steps. Restarting our economy will be gradual and careful and will be guided by science.
Hi, and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Capello. Slow and steady. That's how the federal government describes the reopening of provincial economies that are in their 7th week of COVID-19 restrictions. But Canada's hardest hit province is lifting those measures at what appears to be the fastest pace in this country. Quebec reported more than 700 new cases of COVID-19 today. Officials announced, though, 3 types of businesses will be allowed to open beginning next week. Most stores will be allowed to reopen, but shopping centres will remain closed for now. Stores in the Montreal area will follow suit 1 week later. Companies operating in construction and manufacturing across Quebec will also restart on May 11th. Physical distancing will have to be maintained, though. This all follows yesterday's announcement that many elementary schools and daycares in the province can reopen starting May 11th. That has drawn some criticism from parents. Here's Premier François Legault defending his decision.
I think it's important for our children that they go back to school, especially the ones needing special services, the ones having learning difficulties. I think it would be a very bad idea because they got out 2 months ago or about a month and a half. So if you go to September, it means 6 months without going to school. I think it wouldn't be good for children having difficulties, and it represents 20 to 25% of our children. So it's very important, and that's mainly for them that we took this decision.
Premier Legault, as you can hear there, says the situation is under control in his province, despite the number of cases in Quebec representing nearly half of Canada's confirmed cases. For more on Quebec's plan to reopen, I'm joined now by Christopher Skeete, Parliamentary Assistant to Quebec Premier François Legault. He joins us, I believe, from Montreal. Hi, Mr. Skeete. Good to see you.
Very nice to see you guys.
So, Mr. Skeete, your province has the highest number of cases of COVID-19 and deaths linked to the virus, yet you're the only province at this time that appears willing to send kids back to school. Why?
Well, there are 2 Quebecs right now. There's the Quebec that is the elderly folks' homes, the old folks' homes, and there's the Quebec that has the wider population in mind. When we look at the deaths that are occurring in Quebec, 85% of them are occurring in old folks' homes. And if you look at the situation everywhere else, it appears under control. And if you exclude Montreal, and you exclude the surrounding areas of Montreal, there's virtually no issues. So we're trying to take a really systematic and gradual approach in the hopes that we can slowly get Quebec back on track.
I take your point about the division between long-term care homes and the rest of society. In fact, we see it pretty much pervade throughout the country in that I think about 79%, the federal government released data today, 79% of the deaths that have occurred have taken place in long-term care or seniors' homes. But it's not just seniors, for example, who are confined to those homes. There are a number of people who work in the homes but live with other people, including perhaps kids who are going to school. We know that kids can be asymptomatic carriers of this virus. They can bring it back from school and give it to an adult. Why not take a more precautious approach at this time?
Well, actually, our approach is precautious because what we're doing is we're telling parents to make their own decision. For instance, the school that's going to be opening up 2 weeks from now, that gives us another 2 weeks to analyze the trends, the health trends that are going on for regions outside of Montreal. A week after that, so 3 weeks from now, parents are going to have a choice to make as to whether or not they're going to send their kids back to school. And it's a choice. It's going to be a voluntary measure. And we're asking parents to consider what's right for them, how they feel about the risk, how they feel about their particular risk, and also whether or not they have particular health risks that they want to consider or a professional status that would make them decide to keep their kids at home. So we think a voluntary measure is the way to go here. And I think we're trusting the Quebec population to make the right choice.
So you, Mr. Skeete, tweeted that you have made the decision to send, I think you said, your two kids, right, to school?
I have 2 kids that go to elementary school, and we'll be sending them back on May 19th.
So tell me a bit about the decision process for you and how you know 2 weeks out that it's the right choice to make, or 3 weeks, I guess, out that it's the right choice to make, given what if the numbers, for example, are still, they're over 700 today, new cases? What if you're still looking at 500 or 600 new cases a day? Are you still okay sending your kids to school in that environment?
Well, the real metric is not what I think, it's what our public health officials think. And our public health officials have told us that if the trend keeps going, it's safe to send our kids back to school. So provided that the public health agency gives their green light, my kids will be there. When we look at public health, we can't just look at it in terms of COVID. I know that we're seeing, public health as a new issue here, but public health is far more inclusive than just, mitigating a pandemic. Public health includes mental health. It includes conjugal health. It includes making sure that children who depend on breakfast programs at schools get breakfast. Kids that may be subject to abuse at home get identified by their teachers. So public health really has to be more than just protecting our kids from the COVID pandemic. It has to be about overall health. And I think when you look at all these factors, when you take into consideration all these potential issues that can affect children, for my family, for us, it was the right call. And, provided that the green light is still there on May 19th, my kids will be there.
I understand what you're saying, certainly about considering more than just one factor. But there are other provinces that, for example, New Brunswick hasn't seen a new case in 10 days, and they're still refraining from taking the measures or opening schools in the way that your province is. Can you understand how people are asking, is this the right decision?
Yeah, and I think, I would love to meet the person who has the perfect formula for a path forward with COVID-19. But the reality is, every province has to make the right decision for itself. And, the solution that Quebec is going to take is going to vary, from what Ontario might choose to do or what New Brunswick might choose to do. And I think that's right. I think that's a good thing. I think that's what it means to live in a federation where each jurisdiction takes its decisions that are good for them and they go at the rate that they want to go. But again, nothing here is compulsory. In Quebec, the return back to school is going to be based on individual choice. So persons who want to go back can go back. Those who don't have to. So I don't think, I don't think we're doing anything wrong there. And at the same token, if I look around, I'm completely okay with other provinces doing their own thing as well.
It's not a choice, though, for teachers and for staff of the schools. And many of them, through the organizations that represent them, have voiced concern about the fact that they don't feel they will have the personal protective equipment necessary. My understanding is it's not going to be mandated through your government that people like teachers or staff of schools have a certain level of PPE. Why is that? And are you putting their lives in danger?
Well, actually, one of the things that we are going to be doing for teachers is reducing the class size by 50% to a maximum of 15 students. So by having that distancing in the classroom, we're confident that we're going to be protecting teachers. Another thing, again, is the reason why we're not giving PPE is because the public health officials haven't recommended it. And then the third thing that we're looking into doing is the workplace occupational health authorities are trying to put together a guide that's going to help teachers get back to work, which is one of the reasons why we pushed this forward in time into 2 weeks. We wanted to tell people where we were going in terms of our orientations right now. In 2 weeks, the occupational health authorities are going to publish a document and a guide to help keep teachers and students safe. But, at the same time, life goes on. And, the choice that Quebec is making is that, be it now or be it later, any way you slice it, we're going to be stuck with this COVID thing for, depending on which experts you listen to, 12 to 18 months. And Quebec has chosen that it's time to send our kids back to school right now.
With respect, though, Mr. Skeete, when you say that kids, for example, there'll only be 15 kids in a class, they'll be spread out. I mean, we know young kids, they don't always listen to what you tell them to do. If I told a kid who's 6, stay away from another kid, that's probably going to make them do the opposite. And when it comes to PPE, again, I take your point on what the advice you're getting from public health officials, but we've even seen the advice from Canada's top doctor evolve when it comes to wearing masks. So why not, again, take the most precautious route? Why not equip teachers and staff of schools with the most PPE possible in order to mitigate the risk that they feel that they are expressing to your government they are taking on?
Well, again, I take your point about the concerns that people are having, but this is an evolving situation. Number one, the decision doesn't belong to the government whether or not it's recommended to wear protective equipment. It's going to come down to
but you can supply it, surely.
Sure, we could supply it, but we're also going to follow the science. And the scientists, the people who decide, Dr. Arruda, in our case, in our province, he's the one advising us that it's not required. And secondly, and I think this is important, it's also a workplace issue, a workplace safety issue. There's going to be a guide that's going to come out. And if the guide says that this is the best way to keep teachers safe, then, we're going to do what it takes to make everybody safe. But at the same token, we're going to go with what the science says here.
What about when it comes to, and you have indicated, and the Premier did as well, that if things are to change, like if the trend continues, this is the path that you're on, but if things were to change, you will revisit those decisions. By what metric will you make those judgments?
Well, I mean, it's a hypothetical question as to what may or may not happen in 2 weeks, but what we're trying to tell the population, and I think this is very important, is we don't feel committed to this decision at all. Our decision is based on the information that we have today. If for any circumstance the situation were to change, we're quite comfortable taking a step back and reassessing. And I think that's what's important in a crisis like this, is to be nimble, not be afraid to make wrong moves, and to not be afraid to take a step back when it's needed. And I think what we've demonstrated during this crisis is exactly that.
What might necessitate a step back? For example, if you see a spike for a couple of days, or if you see community transmission outside of long-term care homes, new community transition, like what exactly, for viewers who are watching in Quebec right now wondering, okay, well, at what point is the government going to change its mind if they have to? What specifically would you tell them?
Well, it could be a myriad of things. And I mean, I would be remiss to give you any type of one indication. But for instance, a vaccine could be discovered in the next week, which would make us say, well, let's wait 3 weeks before we send everybody back. That's an example where we can't tell the future. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and we're going to react and adjust accordingly. And I think any scenario, we're learning so much about this virus on a day-to-day basis that for me to even imagine myself 2 weeks from now is a little bit utopic, which is why we're giving ourselves that margin to say, listen, if things continue as is, this is the plan, to give people time to adjust with the plan and to get on board with it. And at the same token, if ever it doesn't work out, we're really confident and we're going to take a step back.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Skeete. Appreciate your time as always this evening.
Take care and be safe, everybody.
Christopher Skeete, Parliamentary Assistant to Quebec Premier François Legault. The federal government released updated COVID-19 modeling today. The data shows that the spread of the virus is slowing in most parts across the country and that Canada has seen slower growth than many other countries. The Prime Minister, however, cautioned the fight is far from over. Take a listen.
The measures we've taken so far are working. In fact, in many parts of the country, the curve has flattened, but we're not out of the woods yet. We're in the middle of the most serious public health emergency Canada has ever seen. And if we lift measures too quickly, we might lose the progress we've made.
So how does this new data influence the various plans to reopen parts of this country? How could an easing of public health restrictions affect the spread of COVID-19? Will it? Joining me now is Dr. Isaac Pogue, infectious disease specialist at Toronto General Hospital. Hi, Dr. Pogue. Great to see you again.
Good to see you as well.
So I want to start off with the argument put forth by Premier Legault and Mr. Skeete, who we had on the show just a few minutes ago, about why they feel the data supports their decision to, for example, send kids back to school, elementary schools, in 2 weeks. And what they have described is what they call, or they characterize, two separate epidemics, two separate worlds. The world of what's happening in long-term care homes, and they say about 85% of the deaths in Quebec have occurred there, and the rest of society that they argue they have a good handle on. Is that reason enough, or does that justification work when talking about the decision to send kids back to school?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we can all look at the same data and come out with slightly different conclusions. And, to some degree, he's totally correct in that, a lot of the deaths and a lot of the infections are driven by long-term care facilities, but that still doesn't account for, still a reasonable number of infections outside of long-term care facilities in community settings. And if kids go back to school too soon, this is a perfect opportunity for infections to get transmitted among kids who we know have less severe illness. And of course, kids can amplify this if there are many kids together under one roof. And kids can bring it home, infect their parents, and in a worst case scenario, infect grandparents. And of course, we know people over the age of 60 have a far worse outcome than younger individuals. And in fact, in Canada, they just mentioned that 95% of the deaths are in people over the age of 60. So the concern is really, could these children start to amplify this infection outside of long-term care facilities if they're prematurely gathering together under one roof?
Can you also help us understand, I guess, more generally speaking, the phenomenon in long-term care facilities? I know this is something we have been talking about somewhat anecdotally over the past month, but in that data that the federal government released today was a pretty striking statistic that 79% of all deaths, so Quebec had said 85%, but across the country, 79% of all deaths have occurred in long-term care facilities. And even when you look closer at which provinces are sort of on the not so great end of the curve right now, Quebec and Ontario particularly, it is because of what's happening in long-term care facilities.
Yeah, I mean, it's really awful to watch this unfold, and it clearly exposed some of the weaknesses in care that's been provided in those long-term care facilities that's been, systemic for probably decades. But, in these facilities, we know that there are, an elderly population with multiple medical comorbidities, a frail population, and the resiliency that these individuals have toward an infection is significantly less compared to even the people of the same age that might not be living in a long-term care facility. So, I mean, you factor that plus when it is introduced into a long-term care facility, many, not all, but many of these facilities just don't have strong infection prevention and control initiatives at baseline, so it can spread like wildfire. So the population is certainly more prone to having a bad outcome, and then the location is more prone to spreading an infection, especially one as contagious as this one. And it ends up being a perfect storm. And of course, we've watched how this played out. It's hard to find a silver lining in a pandemic like this, but if there is a silver lining, it's that it's certainly brought to light, some of the neglect and some of the lack of resources that have gone into those facilities. And of course, now all attention is being paid to pouring resources in to really make those safer places. And I just really hope that this continues even in the post-pandemic world, that we provide better care for people in these facilities.
On that point, Dr. Bogosh, viewers will have just seen on their screen some visuals of members of the Army, of the Armed Forces, which of course in Quebec and Ontario have been assigned to a number of these homes. And in addition, the governments in both those provinces have expanded, for example, who can be tested in the homes. They have ramped up the amount of testing done. They have also put in place different policies about, for example, the number of workers or the pay those workers get. When do you expect the data to reflect those changes? Will there be a lag time, as there have been with other policy measures in other areas?
I think it shouldn't be too long. I really think that provinces have done a ton over a short period of time to help protect these vulnerable populations. So as you point out, in better infection and control practices implemented in there, personnel that are only working at one facility as well, so you can't transmit the infection from facility to facility, and then more hands on deck. And I really think it's going to be about a 2-week lag time before we start to see the fruits of this labor. And that's about the maximum incubation period that this virus has. You couple that with increased surveillance and screening of people in long-term care facilities, we're going to see some dramatic improvements in the very near future because, quite frankly, they have really poured a lot of attention into these facilities and for the better. I think there's some excellent policies that are now being implemented.
We got some, we have been discussing over the past few minutes, the data that we received from the federal government. What this was, I should be clear for our viewers, was an update to modeling that was released about 19 days ago. I'm pretty sure we spoke with you that evening as well. One of the big headlines that jumped out at me was that the number of cases at that time was doubling every 3 days. It's now doubling every 16 days. There was a whole bunch of graphs released today, different data points, comparisons when it comes to the provinces. For viewers that are watching right now, should we be overall encouraged by what we saw, or how would we best interpret it from your perspective?
I mean, first of all, it's fantastic. This is a success story. Of course, it's not over yet. It's not even close to being over yet, but it's okay to pause for a minute and pat ourselves on the back collectively as Canadians, because all these measures that we've been living under are paying off. That curve is flattening. The rate of rise in cases is going down, and there's hard data that's demonstrating it. So that's fantastic news. Of course, it's not over yet. Of course, it's sadly just the end of the beginning, and we need to see a sustained reduction in the number of new cases. We need to get not just at the top of the curve, but down to the bottom of the curve. We need to maintain that over time. But it just goes to show us that it's as tough as it is living under these very stringent public health requirements that we are under now. It's totally working, and there's hard data driving that. So good for us, but keep the foot on the gas pedal because there's still a long way to go. And
when you say the gas pedal, and I think we've heard this from a lot of politicians today as well, right? Like, don't ease off. It's not over yet. Yeah. In tangible terms, I think, again, a number of people are watching going, well, this is working. Can we stop doing it? Can I do a little bit less? Like, I think they want to know how their own lives are going to be impacted going forward. What's your advice to them?
Yeah, well, here's what I would do. Number one, you got to start to see a sustained reduction in the number of new cases per day, and you've got to see that over probably a period of 2 weeks. After a period of 2 weeks, if it's not, obviously more than a trend and you have reduced the burden of illness in a community, you can start to lift these public health restrictions that we're living under. We've heard about the province's plans. Everyone's got a 3-point plan or a 5-point plan. Many of the plans are basically very similar in that there's a gradual change towards lifting these restrictions, and there's sort of some highlights of what that means at different points in the plan. I think people have to recognize that this is not just a linear path forward. If there are outbreaks or if there's an unacceptably high number of cases, we might go backwards and regress a little bit and have more stringent public health restrictions, maybe similar to what we have now. But in terms of hard numbers, yeah, we're currently seeing about 1,300 to 1,500 new cases of COVID-19 in Canada per day. We've got to get that down dramatically, probably below 500 new cases per day before they're going to even think about lifting some of these measures. Certainly, there's going to be interprovincial differences, but we're well on that pathway. We just need to keep going down that pathway before, and it'll probably be a couple of weeks, maybe 2 to 4 weeks before we start to see the strict measures that we're living under start to lift a little bit.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks as always for your expertise and your insights, Dr. Bogosh. Really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Many elementary schools and daycares in Quebec could begin reopening in less than 2 weeks. That announcement, though, has drawn some criticism from parents. Premier François Legault says one of the reasons for moving ahead is a concern for kids with learning disabilities, saying it's important for them to be back in the classroom. The Premier also repeated today that parents have the option of keeping their kids at home. So how are parents reacting to the news? Corinne Payne is the general manager of the Quebec Federation of Parent Committees. She joins us from Montreal. Hi, Ms. Payne. Good to see you. Thanks for making time.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we talked to Christopher Skeete, who is the parliamentary secretary to the Premier a bit earlier in the show. And I asked him, what's the justification for this? And he really said the way that their government views it is there's two worlds, what's happening in long-term care homes and what's happening outside of them, and that they feel they have pretty good control of the world outside, and this is a step they feel they could comfortably take. What do you think?
I think there's reason to believe that. I mean, this whole deconfinement and returning to schools has presented as a gradual, cautious, non-obligatory procedure. There's a lot of ifs, and as the saying goes, the devil is in the details, and there's a lot of details, and we can't lose view that we're dealing with our children. And I'm sure for the parents of Quebec and the parents all across Canada, our children are the most precious thing in our lives, and we want to make sure that we do what's best for them. And that's probably where the concerns are coming, and not the pushback, but the concerns are coming from the parents, definitely.
And I think there's also additional scrutiny on the decision just because it's the first one. We're seeing, for example, so many cases in Quebec, and I totally get the point the government is making about long-term care facilities, but the highest number of cases, the highest number of deaths, also the first province to make this move. Other provinces are really resistant. If you are hearing from parents, are they concerned right now? I know that's voluntary. Are you getting a sense that they're going to be sending their kids to school? What are you hearing?
Well, every Monday night we have a meeting with parents from all across Quebec, and I can tell you that last night, in a period of 2 hours, we got 200 questions, to give you an idea. 40% of the parents that were assisting in that call are undecided at this point in time. The children want to get back and see their friends, and yes, life has to go on, and we have to do this, but I think right now parents are missing a level of clarity, a level of reassurance. They want to know what public health guidelines guidelines are being put in place. Everybody understands the 2 meters. I think everybody across Canada knows what 2 meters means now. Here in Quebec, it's going to be 15 students per class. But then there's some ambiguities. What does regular cleaning mean? What does strict guidelines mean? What does we'll adjust and reorganize, et cetera? Although it's all beautiful words, but what do those actually mean when we get down to the details? And it's the clear documents, I think, and a clear explanation that needs to be sent to parents we have 2 languages to deal with in Quebec, but not just a language issue. There's other languages in Quebec, especially in the hardest hit area of Montreal in Quebec. But we also need to have a language that's simple, that everybody understands and that our children can understand, because before they go back to school, as parents, we want to prepare them as well and tell them, what does it mean when we say that you have to stay 2 meters apart? They've been out all at home. They don't, we need to prepare them to go back to school and know what those guidelines and help the school system.
And on the school system, I apologize. In about 30 seconds, I have to pause and welcome our viewers, or in about a minute rather, welcome our viewers who are joining us on their local stations. But I do want to continue asking you questions about this. Do you anticipate it's going to be a lot different depending on the school board? Because my understanding is a lot of those decisions will be left to them as well, or to implement it.
Well, there's certain things that need to be taken on a provincial standpoint, and then there's definitely each school and each region that needs to make the decisions that are best for them. I mean, we have schools in Quebec that have 60 students, and we have schools that have 1,200 students. So the decision is going to be a little bit different. Parents have a choice to make at elementary school. Are they going to send their children, or are they not going to send their children? In high school, it's been decided our high schools will not open until September. And that has another whole aspect of things to consider.
And if you don't mind, I'm going to pause you there just for 1 second as we kind of fade to black, and then we'll jump back up on the local stations. We're back in just a moment here on Power and Politics. Stay with us. Welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Capellos. You're watching right here on CBC News Network. Thanks for joining us on your local CBC stations in both Ontario and Quebec. We are in the midst of a discussion on what's happening in Quebec with Corinne Payne. She's the general manager of the Quebec Federation of Parent Committees. And Corinne and I were just talking about the Quebec government's plan to send elementary kids back to school. Corinne, you were touching on the prospect of high school. Yes. No detailed timeline on that yet. What are you hearing from parents around that?
Well, in high school, there's no choice. Well, the children will be staying at home until September. And the biggest concern there that we hear from parents is around their motivation, their psyche as well, their psychological development. They need to be with their friends as well. They're at a very crucial age in their development where they need to interact with other people of their age. They love, that they can go to the fridge all hours of the day, but at the same time, they do have other things to do. And on our meeting last night, we did a little, impromptu survey, so it's not scientifically based, but this is the feedback we've gotten from high school students. 20% of them, because our high school students will be offered learning from a distance. 20% of them are super motivated, 20% are not interested at all, and 60% will do it if they're obliged to do it. So we're going to definitely have some struggles and some battles as parents to get our high school students studying from a distance over the next 2 months, without a doubt.
Before I let you go, speaking of distance, I just want to get your take on one thing that kind of jumped out at me, and I think anybody who knows kids in elementary school, the idea that they are going to remain physically distant. And I understand that the number of kids, I think it's 15, as you mentioned, is generally reduced in classrooms. But we have heard from some teachers' organizations that are worried, for example, that teachers aren't going to have enough PPE, concerned also that are kids actually going to stay apart? I mean, how difficult do you think enforcing physical distancing in the school setting might be?
Well, I have a high schooler here, and he's like, Mom, how are they going to keep the kids apart in elementary school? Like they just want, they're always together. They're playing, it's games, it's, learning biggest part of learning is through games and all that sort of stuff. So it's definitely going to be a challenge. And I think that's the concern. And we have, 40% of our school bus drivers that are over 60. There's certain schools where half of the teachers are over 60. They're not even recommended to return to school. There's children that live with their grandparents. There's children that, their parents are older. So there's definitely a lot of concerns there, and they all have to be addressed. So it's dealing with humans, and when we deal with humans, it's never easy.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much, Corinne. I really appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you for having me. Have a great evening.
Corinne Payne is the general manager of the Quebec Federation of Parent Committees. As we were discussing, Canada's two biggest provinces right now are the hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet this week, they are rolling out very different strategies for reopening their economies. Today, Quebec announced that some retail businesses will be able to open in less than 2 weeks, along with the construction and manufacturing sectors. Yesterday, as Corinne and I were just talking about, the province said daycares and elementary schools would begin to open at the same time. Ontario, on the other hand, is keeping its schools closed until at least May 31st, has no specific date for reopening other businesses. Here's Ontario Premier Doug Ford reacting to Quebec's decision to reopen its schools.
Well, that's going to be up to Premier Legault. We're taking the advice off our chief medical officer and our health table and our health experts, and we don't want to put our kids at risk. That's really what it comes down to. I'm not going to put our children in a classroom, crowded classroom. I'm just not going to do it. We've got to protect our children at all costs, and we'll make that decision by the end of the month as we come forward. But no, I wouldn't do that here in Ontario.
So what does that divide mean for cities along the Ontario-Quebec border? Jim Watson is the mayor of Ottawa. He joins us from that city. Hi, Mayor Watson. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Vashi. Appreciate it.
Thanks for being with us. I want to start off with what we heard from the Premier yesterday and today around the reopening of the economy here in Ontario. The idea that the first phase, for example, won't kick in until there's a decline in cases every day for 2 to 4 weeks. When that first phase does kick in, what might that look like here in Ottawa?
Well, I think you'll start to see things like parks opening. There's a lot of pressure on us to open parks because, people have their kids at home and I think going a little bit stir crazy with cabin fever. They want to get out and play. I think you'll see companies, whether it's landscape companies and so on, up and running. We're planning, for instance, on opening our farmers markets. We have, I think, about 15 or 20 around the city, the big one at Lansdowne Park. We want to have that opportunity up and running for the farmers who planted the seeds in the fall and they want to start selling their products. But at the same time, it'll be a lot different than normal. If you go to our farmers markets normally on a Saturday or Sunday, they're just packed with people, cheek by jowl, and that's going to have to stop, obviously, because of COVID-19, and make sure that we have proper social distancing and only so many people into the farmers market at a time, like they're doing right now at grocery stores.
You mentioned parks, Mayor, and I know the discussion over the past few weeks has been sort of a back and forth about how far do you go in enforcing or trying to crack down on people who are, as you mentioned, itching to get out and in some cases feeling very confined to a small space. What do you think about the way in which that balance has been struck? I know you've spoken before about some of the level of fines that have been imparted on citizens, but then also striking a balance between trying to enforce what you think is necessary for safety.
Yeah, I think what we tried to do, the province sets a lot of these rules and regulations, and they're the ones that ban people from, told us to close our parks. And I support that. We're taking a little bit of a different angle. We're allowing people to go through the parks. If you want to cycle through the park or jog or walk through it, we just don't want you to stay and have a bit of a coffee clutch and have the kids play on the playground equipment, because that's where the spread takes place of COVID-19, one of the ways it does. And so we're trying to find that balance between trying to give people an opportunity to go out and enjoy some of the good weather we finally have, but at the same time respect the fact that medical professionals are telling us time and time again, we have to be very cautious when we reopen the economy. And I support what Premier Ford is doing. It's a more cautious, slower approach, but I'd rather do it that way than have to face the angst of us having a second wave come back and meet us and then shut these businesses down and close the parks back down again. So I'd rather be slow and cautious than, politically popular. I think, lots of people would like to see us open the parks tomorrow. But until we get that all clear signal from our health professionals, I think the wise thing to do is to be cautious and do it in a staged manner as opposed to all at once. And we end up in a situation where I don't think we want to put these small business people through the ringer again. Many of them are struggling now just to survive.
Speaking of the speed at which various jurisdictions are deciding to reopen their economy, you're kind of in the unique position to preside over a city that borders another one from a different province. We heard from the Premier of Quebec today. Their plans in about 2 or 3 weeks' time to start sending kids back to school, as well as opening larger sectors of the economy. Given your position right here on the border, do you have any concerns about that?
Not really. We have a really good relationship with our counterparts, and my counterpart, Maxime Penneau-Jobin, across the river in Gatineau. We are economies that are interconnected. Our bus systems serve both communities. Their buses come into our jurisdiction and vice versa. They've done something I don't particularly agree with, of putting checkpoints on the Gatineau side, the Quebec side, to limit people coming into their community unless they have legitimate reasons for doing that. In an ideal world, you'd like to have everyone, follow the same guidelines and timetable. But I don't think it's going to be a great disadvantage or advantage for either side that one set of shops opens sooner. I think most people realize that, our schools are not going to go back until certainly after May 31st. The province of Quebec have decided that their schools are going to go ahead. That will have no impact because you have to live in Quebec to go to Quebec schools. So it's not as if there are people living in Ottawa going to school in elementary school or high school in Quebec. And I think, the other thing is that we've got our economies are interconnected from tourism, from transit, and just the sheer number of federal public servants that live in Ottawa and work in Quebec and vice versa. Those people are not being stopped, and they'll continue to go to work. A lot of them are now working from home, so it's not a big issue at this point.
So you're not worried about any increased risk, I guess, given the incongruent nature of the sort of two approaches? And I only ask because having watched both their press conferences pretty closely the past few days, there is a pretty striking difference, right? In Premier Legault's argument, to a certain degree, seems to be that so much of what's happening in Quebec is confined to long-term care homes, whereas Premier Ford seems, extra cautious at this juncture, just given the fact that we're seeing still a few spikes in the numbers and things like that.
Yeah, and we're seeing that too. We had, I think, the largest number of deaths, unfortunately, yesterday in the city of Ottawa, and the great work that Dr. Etches and her team are doing in public health to get the information out that we're not through this. We haven't even come close at this point to the peak. But the reality is that, for instance, Ms. Premier Legault announced the construction industry is going to get back up and running. Well, we've had the construction industry open and running by and large for road projects, transit projects, major hospital construction projects. Those things have continued to go ahead on the Ottawa side. So in some ways, Quebec is catching up to Ontario in that particular case.
And just quickly before I let you go, Mayor, you talked about the situation in Ottawa. So you're saying that you don't even, from the data you're looking at, the peak in Ottawa has not even been reached?
No, not yet. There's some positive signs you see one day, but then you're hit with the very sad and tragic news of the number of deaths that we saw yesterday. And as you know, we're testing people in long-term care homes, so I think you'll start to see a spike in the numbers again, because every single person who lives and works in a long-term care home will be tested, and that will bring the numbers back up again. So it's a fluid situation, and it's a challenge for everyone. And what we're trying to do is to ask our residents to be patient and thoughtful. And the vast majority of people in Ottawa have been respectful of the rules and regulations. Sometimes the coverage on one person getting a ticket for playing in a park overshadows the fact that of the thousands of calls we've received, I think we've issued less than 100 tickets. And that really is after warnings and so on, that we have to ensure that those people are not being selfish and going in and potentially spreading the virus or contracting the virus and bringing it back home to their loved ones.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mayor Watson. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you for your time. Merci.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.